The old church stood at the edge of Millbrook, its weather-beaten walls telling tales of decades gone by. The autumn of 1957 had brought more than just falling leaves to this small Tennessee town. It had brought Brother Thomas, a slight man who walked with a pronounced limp and carried a worn leather Bible under his arm. The locals didn't know what to make of him at first. He spoke with a gentle voice that seemed almost too soft for a preacher, and his twisted leg made him look more like someone who needed help than someone who could offer it. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength that made people stop and listen, even if they didn't want to. The trouble started one Sunday morning when the Henderson gang rode into town. They were infamous throughout the county, not for any major crimes, but for the kind of meanness that made decent folks cross the street when they saw them coming. Led by the burly Pat Henderson, they'd made a habit of terrorizing small towns across 3 states, taking what they wanted and leaving broken windows and broken spirits in their wake. That particular morning, Brother Thomas was sweeping the church steps, his movements slow but deliberate. The gang pulled up their motorcycles right in front of the church, the roar of their engines drowning out the morning birds. Pat Henderson, with his leather vest and 3-day stubble, looked down at the limping preacher and let out a laugh that made the hair stand up on the back of people's necks. "Well, look what we got here, boys," Pat called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Seems like God sent us a broken shepherd for these lost sheep." His gang members snickered, the sound echoing off the church walls. Brother Thomas just kept sweeping, his eyes on his work, but his grip on the broom handle tightened ever so slightly. The townspeople watching from their windows held their breath. They'd seen this kind of scene play out before. It never ended well for anyone who stood up to the Hendersons. "I'm talking to you, cripple," Pat spat, stepping closer. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore folks when they're addressing you?" He kicked at the neat pile of leaves Brother Thomas had just swept together, scattering them across the steps. The preacher finally looked up, and something in his gaze made Pat Henderson take half a step back before he caught himself. "Son," Brother Thomas said quietly, "there's coffee brewing inside. Why don't you and your friends come in and have a cup? Seems to me like you all might be carrying something heavy, and I'm not talking about those motorcycles." The gang burst out laughing, but there was an edge to it now, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. Pat's face darkened. "You think you know something about heavy burdens, old man? Looking at you, I doubt you could even lift one." Brother Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There was a time," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness, "when I carried burdens that would make those motorcycles of yours look like children's toys. But that was before I found a different path." Something in the way he said it made the smart ones in the gang shift uncomfortably. There was history in those words, dark and deep, like still water that hides what lies beneath. But Pat Henderson had never been known for his wisdom. "Well, why don't you tell us about these burdens of yours?" Pat sneered, stepping onto the first church step. "Seems like a good morning for a story." The townspeople who had gathered at a safe distance saw something change in Brother Thomas's face, just for a moment, like a shadow passing over still water. He leaned his broom against the church wall and straightened up as much as his twisted leg would allow. "You know," he said, "I think you're right. It is a good morning for a story. But first, Pat Henderson, why don't you tell me about that night in Oak Ridge 3 years ago? The one that still keeps you up at night?" The color drained from Pat's face. Behind him, his gang members exchanged confused looks. Nobody was supposed to know about Oak Ridge. Nobody who wasn't there that night. Brother Thomas's voice remained gentle, but his words carried the weight of mountains. "Or should I tell that story instead? I know all about burden, son. I know about the kind that leaves marks on your soul, not just your body. The real question is, are you ready to hear about it?" The morning wind rustled through the scattered leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll. The story of Brother Thomas was about to unfold, and nothing in Millbrook would ever be quite the same again. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Pat Henderson stood frozen on the church steps, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. His gang members shifted uneasily on their motorcycles, looking between their leader and the mysterious preacher who somehow knew their closely guarded secrets. Brother Thomas broke the heavy silence with a gentle sigh. "Come inside, all of you," he said, gesturing toward the church door. "Some stories are better told in the light of God's house than in the shadow of man's judgment." To everyone's surprise, including his own, Pat Henderson nodded slowly. His gang members exchanged uncertain glances before killing their engines. The sudden silence felt almost supernatural, broken only by the sound of boots on wooden steps and Brother Thomas's uneven gait as he led them into the church. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the worn wooden pews. Brother Thomas made his way to the front, each step measured and deliberate. He turned to face the gang, who had clustered together near the back like schoolboys called to the principal's office. 15 years ago, Brother Thomas began, his voice carrying easily in the church's perfect acoustics, there was a man they called the Ghost. Not because he was pale or scary, mind you, but because he could get in and out of any place without leaving a trace. Banks, warehouses, private homes, nothing was safe from him. Pat Henderson's eyes widened with recognition. The Ghost was a legend in certain circles, a mystery that had never been solved. Some said he'd died in a job gone wrong, others claimed he'd made enough to retire to some tropical island. Nobody knew the truth, until now. The Ghost had a particular talent, Brother Thomas continued, absently rubbing his twisted leg. He could read people like books. Could tell just by watching someone what kind of burden they carried, what secrets kept them up at night. Made him very good at what he did. Made him dangerous in ways that went beyond just stealing. The sunlight shifted, and for a moment, Brother Thomas's shadow on the wall looked different, taller, straighter, somehow more menacing. "But the thing about ghosts," he said softly, "is that they're often running from something themselves. In my case, yes, Pat, I was the ghost. I was running from the memory of a night much like the one you can't forget. A night when a simple job turned into something else entirely." Pat sank into the nearest pew, his legs seemingly unable to hold him up any longer. His gang members followed suit, their eyes fixed on the limping preacher who had just revealed himself to be one of the most notorious criminals of the previous decade. "It was supposed to be a simple warehouse job," Brother Thomas continued. "But there was a guard there who wasn't supposed to be there. A young man working overtime to buy his daughter a birthday present. He had a photo of her on his desk, she was missing her front teeth in the picture, had the sweetest smile you'd ever seen. The church grew so quiet you could hear the dust motes settling on the pews. I didn't hurt him," Brother Thomas said, his voice heavy with old pain. "But I didn't stop the others from doing it either. I just watched, told myself it wasn't my problem. He lived, thank God, but that night changed everything. I couldn't outrun the sound of his daughter crying in the hospital room when I went to see what I'd allowed to happen." He paused, looking directly at Pat Henderson. "Just like you couldn't outrun the sound of that old shopkeeper's pleas in Oak Ridge, could you, Pat? The one who reminded you of your grandfather?" Pat's face crumpled, and for the first time, his gang saw their leader cry. "How?" he whispered. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been where you are," Brother Thomas replied gently. "Standing at the crossroads between who you are and who you could be. The weight of it feels impossible to bear, doesn't it? Like you're carrying the whole world's judgment on your shoulders." He moved closer to the gang, his limp more pronounced with each step. "This leg," he said, gesturing to his twisted limb. "Got it running from the police after that warehouse job. Jumped from a third-story window, landed wrong. But you know what? It was the best thing that could have happened to me. Lying in that alley, leg shattered, I finally stopped running. Finally faced the truth about who I was and what I'd become." The morning light had shifted again, and now it fell directly on Brother Thomas, illuminating him in a way that made him look both more human and somehow more than human at the same time. "The good news," he said with a small smile, "is that it's never too late to stop running. Never too late to choose a different path. I found mine here, in God's house, helping others carry their burdens instead of adding to them." He looked around at the gang members, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "The question is, what path will you choose? Because let me tell you something I learned the hard way, the past might make us who we are, but it doesn't have to define who we'll become." Pat Henderson stood up slowly, his usual swagger completely gone. "The shopkeeper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been sending him money anonymously. Every month. It's not enough, I know, but—" Brother Thomas nodded. "It's a start. Sometimes that's all we need, just a place to start. The rest of the path reveals itself one step at a time." The church fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the tense quiet of before, but something more contemplative, more hopeful. Outside, the autumn wind had picked up, sending leaves dancing past the windows in swirls of red and gold, nature's own testimony to the possibility of change. The confession hung in the air like morning mist, changing everything it touched. Several of Pat's gang members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, each carrying their own unspoken burdens. Brother Thomas watched them with understanding in his eyes, recognizing the silent battle raging within each man. One of the younger gang members, a boy who couldn't have been more than 20, cleared his throat. I write letters," he said hesitantly. "To my mama. Never send them, but I write them every week. Tell her I'm sorry for stealing her savings. Tell her I'm gonna make it right someday." Brother Thomas nodded encouragingly. "What's stopping you from sending them?" The boy looked down at his hands, calloused from motorcycle handlebars and rough living. "Shame, I guess. Been 2 years now. Feels too late." "Too late," Brother Thomas repeated thoughtfully, making his way to the church's old piano. He ran his fingers along its scarred wood surface. "You know, when I first came to this church, this piano was nothing but a home for mice and dust. Keys all warped, strings rusted. The deacons wanted to throw it out, said it was too far gone to save." He pressed a key, and a clear, perfect note rang through the church. "Took me 6 months to restore it. Every day after prayers, I'd work on it little by little. Sometimes it felt hopeless, like I was fooling myself thinking it could ever make music again." He played a simple chord, the harmony filling the space with warmth. "But here it is, good as new. Because it's never too late for restoration, son. Never too late to make things right." Pat Henderson stood up suddenly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I need some air," he mumbled, heading for the door. But instead of the angry storm out his gang had seen countless times before, this was different, the walk of a man carrying a heavy load he wasn't sure how to put down. Brother Thomas watched him go, then turned to the remaining gang members. "Each of you has a story," he said quietly. "Each of you has a moment that haunts you, a crossroads where you took the harder path because the easier one seemed impossible. I know, because I've been there. Let me tell you about the day I decided to stop being the ghost." He settled into a pew, his twisted leg stretched out carefully. "It was a week after I hurt my leg. I was hiding in a cheap motel, running a fever from an infection I couldn't treat properly without risking a hospital visit. Had enough money to live like a king for the rest of my life, but I couldn't buy a moment's peace." The gang members leaned forward, drawn in by the raw honesty in his voice. "That's when she found me, a cleaning lady at the motel. Could barely speak English, but she saw right through my tough act. Saw I was dying, not just from the infection, but from something deeper. She could have called the police, could have ignored me entirely. Instead, she brought me soup and antibiotics, sat with me while the fever broke. Outside, they could see Pat pacing in front of the church, his internal struggle visible in every step. Brother Thomas continued, "She told me about her son, who died in prison. Said she couldn't save him, but maybe she could save me. God gives second chances, she told me, but you have to be brave enough to take them." He stood up, making his way to the church window. The money I'd stolen? Every penny went to starting rehabilitation programs in prisons. The cleaning lady, her name was Rosa, she helped me set it all up. She's gone now, but her kindness lives on in every person who finds their way back to the light. One of the older gang members spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "But how do you live with it? The memories, the shame, it doesn't just go away, does it?" Brother Thomas turned back to face them, his expression gentle but firm. "No, it doesn't. And it shouldn't. Those memories, that shame, they're part of who we are. But they don't have to be chains that bind us. They can be the foundation we build something better on." He gestured to his leg. "Every step I take reminds me of who I was, but it also reminds me of who I chose to become. Every time this leg aches, I thank God for the pain because it means I'm still here, still able to make a difference." Through the window, they could see Pat had stopped pacing. He stood at the church steps, head bowed, looking more lost than any of his gang had ever seen him. Brother Thomas smiled slightly. "Your leader out there? He's standing at his own crossroads right now. The same one I stood at, the same one each of you will face. The question isn't whether you deserve a second chance, none of us do, really. The question is whether you're brave enough to take it when it's offered." The youngest gang member stood up, fidgeting with his leather jacket. I think I'm gonna go call my mama," he said quietly. "Been carrying her number in my wallet all this time." Brother Thomas nodded. "The church office is down that hall. Take all the time you need." As the young man walked away, his steps getting lighter with each stride, Brother Thomas addressed the remaining gang members. "You know, when you all rode up this morning, you thought you were just finding an easy target. Instead, you found a mirror, one that shows you not just who you are, but who you could be." He made his way toward the church door, toward Pat Henderson's solitary figure. "The hardest part of change isn't deciding to do it," he said over his shoulder. "It's taking that first step when every part of you is screaming to run the other way. But here's something I've learned, sometimes God sends us angels in disguise to help us take that step. For me, it was a cleaning lady in a cheap motel. For you." He smiled, patting his twisted leg. "Well, sometimes he sends a broken-down old preacher with a past of his own." The morning sun had risen higher now, its light streaming through the stained glass windows and painting the church floor in a kaleidoscope of colors. Outside, Pat Henderson turned as he heard Brother Thomas's uneven steps approaching, his face showing the same lost expression that had once graced the face of a master thief in a cheap motel room, waiting for either redemption or ruin. The autumn wind carried the sound of a mother's joyful crying from the church office, where the youngest gang member was finally having the conversation he'd put off for 2 years. Brother Thomas approached Pat Henderson slowly, his uneven footsteps marking a steady rhythm on the wooden steps. Pat didn't turn around immediately. His shoulders were hunched, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of memories he'd tried so hard to outrun. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That shopkeeper in Oak Ridge, his name was Bill Chen. He had this little garden behind his store. Grew vegetables for the local soup kitchen." Brother Thomas stood quietly beside him, letting the confession come at its own pace. The morning sun had burned away the last of the mist, revealing a town that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold on these church steps. "When we rode into his store that night," Pat continued, his voice growing hoarse, "he was watering those plants. Didn't even come inside right away when he heard us. Said he had to finish or the tomatoes would wilt." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Who thinks about tomatoes when they're being robbed? A man who believes in tomorrow, Brother Thomas answered softly. A man who plants seeds even when the world seems darkest. Pat turned to look at him then, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. You really were him, weren't you? The ghost? I used to hear stories about you when I was just starting out. They said you could walk through walls, that you could disappear into thin air. Brother Thomas smiled slightly. The only magic I had was knowing people better than they knew themselves. It's amazing what you can get away with when you understand what makes people tick. He paused, looking out over the quiet street. But understanding others and understanding yourself are two very different things. From inside the church came the sound of more footsteps, another gang member heading toward the office to make their own call home. Pat watched them go, his expression a mixture of pride and envy. My boys, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the church. They're good kids, most of them. Just lost their way, like I did. Been trying to keep them from going too far, you know? Keep them from crossing lines they can't uncross. Is that what happened in Oak Ridge? Brother Thomas asked gently. A line you couldn't uncross? Pat's face darkened with remembered shame. Bill Chen, he didn't fight back. Didn't try to stop us. Just kept talking about his garden, about how he was growing these special Chinese vegetables his grandfather had taught him about. Said we could take whatever we wanted, but please don't hurt the plants. He swallowed hard. One of the new guys, he thought it was funny. Started pulling up the plants, throwing them around. Bill, he cried. Not for the money we were taking, but for those plants. Brother Thomas nodded slowly. And that's when you saw your grandfather in him. Yeah, Pat whispered. My grandpa had a garden just like that. Used to tell me every plant had a story, had a purpose. When I saw Bill on his knees, trying to save those torn-up plants, it was like seeing my grandpa all over again. He turned to Brother Thomas, his eyes haunted. I lost it. Beat up my own guy pretty bad. Gang nearly fell apart that night. Been trying to make up for it ever since, sending money to Bill, but the real debt you're trying to pay isn't to Bill Chen, is it? Brother Thomas asked quietly. Pat shook his head, a tear finally breaking free to roll down his weathered cheek. Grandpa died while I was in juvenile detention. Never got to tell him I was sorry for stealing from his garden, for breaking his heart. Never got to tell him he was right about everything. Brother Thomas placed a gentle hand on Pat's shoulder. Your grandfather's garden taught you about life, about nurturing things and watching them grow. Bill Chen's garden taught you about redemption, about the cost of destruction. Maybe it's time you planted your own garden, Pat. Time to grow something new from the soil of your regrets. The church door opened again, and another gang member emerged, wiping their eyes after what had clearly been an emotional phone call. Pat watched them, something shifting in his expression. I don't know how, he admitted. Don't know how to be anything other than what I am. None of us do, at first, Brother Thomas replied. When I first stepped into this church, I couldn't even pray without looking over my shoulder for the police. But that's the beauty of grace, it doesn't require us to know the whole path. Just the next step. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper packet. Know what these are? He asked, showing Pat what looked like simple brown seeds. Pat shook his head. Chinese long beans, Brother Thomas said with a smile. Bill Chen sends them to me every spring. Says they're from his grandfather's original stock. He pressed the packet into Pat's hand. He's still there in Oak Ridge, you know. Still tending that garden behind his store. Still growing vegetables for the soup kitchen. Pat stared at the seed packet as if it contained all the mysteries of the universe. You think he'd let me help? With the garden? I think, Brother Thomas said carefully, that a man who believes in tomorrow enough to water his plants while being robbed is a man who can believe in second chances. He paused, letting the words sink in. And I think a man who's been carrying his grandfather's garden in his heart all these years might have something valuable to offer in return. The morning had grown warmer, and with it, something seemed to thaw in Pat Henderson's rigid posture. From inside the church came the sound of his gang members, no, his family, beginning to sing an old hymn they must have learned in childhood, their voices rough but sincere. Brother Thomas turned toward the church door. "Shall we go back inside? Sounds like your boys could use their leader right about now." Pat looked down at the seed packet one more time, then carefully tucked it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. "Yeah," he said, his voice stronger now. "Yeah, I think it's time." As they walked back into the church together, their steps fell into an uneven rhythm, the limping preacher and the reformed outlaw, each carrying their own burden, each finding their way toward something that looked remarkably like hope. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The Henderson gang had spent the entire morning in church. By noon, the town was buzzing with speculation, and by sunset, the story had grown to include a dozen different versions of what had happened behind those old wooden doors. But the truth was far more remarkable than any rumor. Inside the church, something extraordinary was unfolding. The gang members, who had entered as hardened outlaws, were rediscovering pieces of themselves they'd thought long lost. In the church office, the last of them was finishing up his call home, his voice thick with emotion as he promised his sister he'd be there for her graduation. Brother Thomas sat in a pew near the front, watching as Pat Henderson moved among his men, no longer as their leader but as their brother. The transformation in him was subtle but profound, like watching winter turn to spring, one small change at a time. "Brother Thomas," Pat called out, making his way to the front. Some of the boys were wondering, "That rehabilitation program you mentioned, the one you started with the cleaning ladies' help. Is it still running?" The old preacher nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Rose Haven Rehabilitation Center. Just outside of Nashville. Still going strong after all these years." One of the older gang members stepped forward, removing his leather jacket for the first time since they'd arrived. Without it, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "I've got a brother in prison," he said quietly. "Been there 3 years. Nobody's visited him since the first month." "Write down his name," Brother Thomas said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "I'll make some calls. The program's always looking for mentors who understand the journey." He glanced meaningfully at Pat. "People who've walked the harder path and found their way back." Pat's eyes widened with understanding. "You think someone like me could?" "I think someone exactly like you could make all the difference," Brother Thomas replied. "The best guides are often those who know every wrong turn by heart." The church door creaked open, and to everyone's surprise, the town's mayor stepped in. She paused at the threshold, taking in the unusual scene before her, the notorious Henderson gang sitting in pews, some with tears in their eyes, others writing letters or making plans. "Brother Thomas," she said cautiously, "everything all right in here?" Mrs. Wilson at the diner said she saw. She trailed off, unsure how to describe what the town had been witnessing all morning. "Everything's more than all right, Mayor," Brother Thomas smiled. "In fact, I believe we might need to discuss expanding our community outreach programs. Seems we're about to have some eager new volunteers." Pat stepped forward, and the mayor instinctively tensed. But there was something different about him now, a humility in his bearing that had never been there before. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. "About those windows we broke at the community center last month, we'd like to fix them. And maybe, if you're willing, we could help with that after-school program you've been trying to get started." The mayor blinked in surprise, looking between Pat and Brother Thomas. The preacher just nodded encouragingly, his eyes twinkling. "Well," she said slowly, "we do need someone to teach the kids basic motorcycle maintenance. Keep them from learning it on the streets like." She paused, a small smile forming. "Like some others did." One of the younger gang members perked up. I used to be a certified mechanic, before. I could teach them proper safety, maintenance, everything I wish someone had taught me. The energy in the church shifted again, as possibilities began to bloom like flowers after a long winter. One by one, the gang members started offering their skills: carpentry, electrical work, cooking, even art. Talents they'd left behind in their rush to become the tough guys they thought they needed to be. Brother Thomas watched it all with quiet satisfaction, remembering another group of lost souls he'd worked with in those early days after leaving his life as the ghost. "You know," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "there's something powerful about using your past to pave someone else's future. Each mistake we've made can become a lesson we teach. Each wrong turn can become a map showing others the right path." The mayor had fully entered the church now, her initial fear replaced by cautious optimism. She pulled out her phone and started making notes as the gang members continued sharing ideas. "The town council meets on Thursday," she said. "I think they need to hear some of these proposals directly from you all." Pat looked uncertain for a moment, then squared his shoulders. "We'll be there," he said. "Cleaned up and respectful. No leather, no bikes." He glanced at his gang members. "Time we showed this town who we really are, not just who we've been pretending to be." One of the gang members who hadn't spoken much all morning suddenly stood up. "My grandmother's house," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The one we've been using as a hangout. She left it to me when she died, said she hoped I'd make it a home someday. Maybe we could turn it into something good. A halfway house or something, for guys trying to get back on their feet." Brother Thomas's eyes grew misty. "Rosa, the cleaning lady who helped me, she always said that true redemption isn't just about changing yourself. It's about changing the world around you, even if it's just a small piece of it." The afternoon light slanted through the stained glass windows, painting everyone in shades of gold and blue and purple. Outside, the town of Millbrook continued about its business, unaware that within these walls, a small miracle of transformation was taking place. "Brother Thomas," Pat said suddenly, "would you ride out to Oak Ridge with me tomorrow? To see Bill Chun?" He touched the seed packet in his pocket. "I think it's time I planted something new." The old preacher smiled, patting his twisted leg. "I don't ride anymore, son. But I'll drive out there with you. Some journeys are better taken together." The mayor watched this exchange with growing wonder, beginning to understand that she was witnessing not just the redemption of a gang, but the rebirth of her entire community. Sometimes, she realized, the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places, even from a group of outlaws who had laughed at a limping preacher on a Sunday morning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect for new beginnings. Brother Thomas's old pickup truck rumbled down the highway toward Oak Ridge, with Pat Henderson sitting unusually quiet in the passenger seat. The seed packet rested in his lap, a small thing carrying the weight of enormous possibilities. "You're awful quiet," Brother Thomas observed, navigating the truck around a gentle curve. "Having second thoughts?" Pat shook his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Just thinking about the boys back in Millbrook. Never seen them so alive. They were up half the night, making plans for the community center, drawing up schedules for the youth program." He smiled slightly. "Barely recognized them without their tough guy acts." "Sometimes," Brother Thomas replied, "we wear our masks for so long we forget they're not our real faces." He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his twisted leg stretched out comfortably. "Speaking of the boys, how'd they take to the mayor's dress code for the council meeting?" Pat actually chuckled. "You should have seen it. Big Joe, you know, the one built like a bear? He's got a three-piece suit from his sister's wedding. Says it still fits, mostly. And little Pete, he's borrowing his dad's tie. First time he's spoken to his old man in 5 years." The conversation paused as they passed a sign welcoming them to Oak Ridge. Pat's hand instinctively went to the seed packet, his fingers tracing its edges. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" he asked quietly. "What if all the money I've been sending just reminded him of the worst night of his life?" Brother Thomas turned onto a side street, the one he knew led to Bill Chen's store. "You know what I learned about forgiveness," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It's not just about the person being forgiven. Sometimes, it's a gift the forgiver gives themselves. Carrying anger is like carrying hot coals, you're the one getting burned." The store came into view, looking much the same as Pat remembered it. The simple sign reading, "Chen's Market," hung above the door, and even from the street, they could see the garden flourishing behind the building. Pat's breath caught in his throat. "He's expanded it," he whispered. "The garden, it's twice the size it was." Brother Thomas parked the truck and turned to Pat. "Ready?" Pat nodded slowly, though his face had gone pale. They made their way to the store's entrance, the bell above the door chiming softly as they entered. The interior was cool and dim after the morning sunlight, filled with neat shelves and the smell of fresh vegetables. At the counter stood an elderly Asian man, his hair more gray than black now, but his eyes still sharp and alert. He looked up as they entered, and his face broke into a warm smile at the sight of Brother Thomas. "Ah, my friend. You're early this year for the seeds." His English was accented but clear, his joy at seeing the preacher genuine. Then his eyes fell on Pat, and the smile faded. Not into anger, as Pat had feared, but into something more complex, recognition, uncertainty, and something that might have been understanding. "Mr. Chen," Brother Thomas said gently, "you remember Pat Henderson?" Bill Chen nodded slowly. "Yes. I remember." He studied Pat's face for a long moment. "You look different without the leather jacket." Pat swallowed hard. "Mr. Chen, He began, but his voice cracked. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the seed packet Brother Thomas had given him. "I heard you still grow vegetables for the soup kitchen." Something shifted in Bill Chen's expression. "You want to know about the garden?" he asked carefully. "I want to learn," Pat said, his voice stronger now. "My grandfather, he taught me once, but I forgot. Forgot a lot of important things. But I'm remembering now, and I thought, maybe." Bill Chen came out from behind the counter. He was shorter than Pat by nearly a foot, but there was a quiet dignity in his bearing that made him seem taller. "The money you've been sending," he said. "It helped expand the garden. We feed 30 families now, every week." Pat blinked in surprise. "You knew it was from me?" Bill smiled slightly. "Who else would send exactly enough each month to replace what was stolen, plus extra for seeds?" He gestured toward the back door. "Come. The morning is the best time to work in the garden. The vegetables, they like the gentle sun." As they followed Bill through the store, Brother Thomas hanging back slightly to let them talk, Pat noticed something. On the wall behind the counter hung a familiar photo, Bill with his grandfather in China, standing in front of an ancient garden. It was the same photo Pat had seen that night, the one that had triggered everything. The garden behind the store was a revelation. Neat rows of vegetables stretched out in all directions, some familiar, others exotic. Trellises heavy with climbing beans reached toward the sky, and the morning air was filled with the smell of herbs and growing things. "Your grandfather," Bill said as he handed Pat a pair of gardening gloves, "what did he grow?" "Tomatoes," Pat replied softly. "And corn. But what he loved most were his green beans. Said they were like people, they just needed something to climb on, and they'd reach for the sun on their own." Bill nodded approvingly. "Wise man." Here, he picked up a trowel and pointed to a fresh bed of soil. "We'll start with the long beans. Brother Thomas brought me the seeds from my hometown last year. They're ready to plant now." As Pat knelt in the soil, Brother Thomas watched from the garden gate, his twisted leg forgotten in the morning sun. He saw Bill Chen teaching Pat the proper depth for the seeds, saw Pat's hands that had caused so much damage, now carefully creating new life. From inside the store came the sound of the bell as customers began arriving. Some paused at the garden gate, surprise evident on their faces at the sight of the notorious Pat Henderson on his knees in the dirt, listening intently as Bill Chen explained about proper spacing between plants. "You'll come back?" Bill asked as they finished planting the first row. "These beans, they need attention. Need someone to guide them as they grow." Pat looked up from the soil, his face more peaceful than it had been in years. "Yes," he said. "I'll come back. And, maybe next time, I could bring some of my boys. They need this too, need to learn about growing things instead of destroying them." Bill Chen smiled, a full, genuine smile this time. "Good. We'll need help when the harvest comes. The soup kitchen, they can always use more vegetables. More hands make the work lighter." Brother Thomas finally stepped forward, his uneven gait marking a peaceful rhythm on the garden path. "You know," he said, looking between the two men, "I believe this is what grace looks like. Not just the forgiveness, but what grows from it." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the garden where an elderly Chinese shopkeeper and a former outlaw worked side by side, planting seeds of something far more important than vegetables. In Millbrook, a group of reformed gang members were preparing for a town council meeting, and in a prison somewhere, a forgotten inmate was about to receive his first visitor in 3 years. Change, Brother Thomas reflected, was like these gardens. It started with a single seed, planted in hope, tended with care, and given time to grow. 1 year later, the garden behind Chen's market had become something of a local legend. What started as a simple vegetable patch had grown into a sprawling community garden that fed hundreds. But more remarkable than the vegetables it produced were the lives it had transformed. On this particular autumn morning, much like the one when our story began, Brother Thomas stood at his church steps, watching a very different scene unfold. Instead of roaring motorcycles, he heard the laughter of children. The Henderson gang's old hangout, the grandmother's house, had become Hope Haven, a transitional home for people trying to rebuild their lives. Pat Henderson, dressed in clean work clothes instead of leather, was leading a group of teenagers in basic motorcycle maintenance classes behind the community center. His voice, once used to intimidate, now patiently explained the importance of proper tool handling and safety procedures. "Who'd have thought?" Mayor Wilson said, coming to stand beside Brother Thomas. 1 year ago, these boys were the terror of 3 counties. Now they're some of our most active community members." Brother Thomas smiled, leaning on his cane, a recent replacement for his limping gait that he'd finally admitted he needed. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of who they really are, beneath all the masks they wear. The mayor nodded toward the church office, where the lights were still on despite the early hour. "Another meeting?" "Rose Haven Rehabilitation Center's board meeting," Brother Thomas confirmed. "Pat's presenting their expansion plans. They're opening a new facility in Oak Ridge, partnering with Bill Chen's garden program." Inside the office, Pat stood before a group of community leaders, his presentation materials neatly organized on the table. The old swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. "The results speak for themselves," he was saying, pointing to a chart. 87% of our participants who complete the garden therapy program stay clean and out of trouble. When we combine that with vocational training. He paused, smiling slightly. "Well, just look at my boys." The boys he referred to had scattered to various legitimate pursuits. Little Pete had reconciled with his father and now helped run the family auto repair shop. Big Joe, still impressive in his size, used his presence to mentor troubled youth instead of intimidating shopkeepers. The youngest one who'd made that first call to his mother was now in community college, studying social work. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation could be seen every Wednesday and Saturday at Chen's Market. There, former gang members worked alongside community volunteers, tending the expanded garden that now included a greenhouse and educational center. Bill Chen, his hair now completely gray but his steps still spry, taught gardening classes to everyone from school children to recovering addicts. The vegetables, he would say, showing them how to properly support a climbing bean plant, they don't care about your past. They only care about how you treat them now. The garden had become more than just a source of food for the soup kitchen. It was a place of healing, where people could literally get their hands dirty while cleaning up their lives. The sight of former outlaws carefully tending to delicate seedlings alongside suburban housewives and business professionals had become so common that it no longer drew curious stares. Brother Thomas made his way inside the church, where preparations were underway for a different kind of gathering. The old piano, once restored by his patient hands, would today accompany a choir made up of recovering addicts and former inmates, people who, like the piano itself, had been considered too far gone to save. As he settled onto the piano bench, his twisted leg finding its familiar position, Brother Thomas heard the rumble of motorcycles approaching. But unlike that morning a year ago, these bikes brought members of the newly formed Second Chance Riders, a group of reformed outlaws who used their riding skills to deliver fresh produce from Chen's garden to homebound seniors and struggling families. The church began to fill with an unlikely congregation, former gang members in clean clothes sitting beside the very townspeople they'd once terrorized, children from the community center's after-school program running up to give Pat high fives, Bill Chen and his family taking their usual seats near the front. Before beginning the service, Brother Thomas looked out over the gathered faces and remembered that morning a year ago when the Henderson gang had roared up to his church, looking for an easy target to mock. How differently things might have turned out if he hadn't shared his own story of redemption, if Bill Chen hadn't opened his garden and his heart to the possibility of change, if Pat Henderson hadn't been brave enough to face his past and choose a different future. As the choir began to sing, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of hard-won peace, Brother Thomas noticed something through the window. In the garden plot they'd started behind the church, inspired by Bill Chen's example, the first shoots of autumn vegetables were pushing through the soil. Like the lives gathered in his church, they were reaching toward the light, growing stronger with each passing day. Pat caught his eye from the congregation and smiled, touching the pocket where he still carried those first seeds Bill Chen had given him. He didn't need them anymore, the garden was flourishing, but he kept them as a reminder of how the smallest things could lead to the biggest changes. After the service, as people lingered to chat and make plans for the week ahead, Brother Thomas overheard a new visitor ask Pat about the story behind Hope Haven and the community garden. Pat glanced toward the preacher, then smiled. "Well," he said, "it all started one morning when a bunch of outlaws laughed at a crippled preacher. Turns out, the joke was on us, in the best possible way." The autumn wind rustled through the trees outside, carrying the promise of change on its breath. In two communities connected by an unlikely friendship between a former thief, a limping preacher, and a gardening shopkeeper, seeds of transformation continued to grow, proving that it's never too late for a new spring to arrive in even the most hardened heart. Brother Thomas ran his hand along his cane, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For every mistake that had led him here, for every wrong turn that had ultimately pointed the way home, for every soul brave enough to believe in second chances, and for the simple truth that sometimes, the most powerful sermons aren't preached from pulpits, but grown in gardens, one seed at a time.